So good evening, folks. This is going to be an informational meeting, presentation from the MMHCA Board of Directors. I'm here just as kind of the representative. I'm Chris DeBoer. I was newly elected president. I'm glad to get to, well, not see all of you, but I hope to get to meet more of you soon. So there's a few purposes for this meeting. First purpose is to clarify some information on the recent election. There was one specific comment that I kept hearing that I wanted to just kind of give a little bit of explanation for. Where we are now, and then where we're heading. So the agenda for this meeting is we're going to explain one of the main concerns that we heard voiced about the election. We're going to look at some of the relevant early history of MMHCA. We're going to look at what's been going on for the past few years, and then also take a look at recent events. In this presentation, we're going to do the best to give as much detailed information as possible, but we still have some information that we don't have access to, and we don't have specific dates for some past events. So my apologies for that. So first off, the election process. Dr. Catherine James and two other members in good standing were assigned to be our election committee. This committee managed the process from calling for our candidates to announcing the results. The committee were the only people to see who voted for whom. Votes were submitted, collected, and tallied by this committee through an existing MMHCA email. And the election committee tallied the votes and verified that the vote came from a member of the organization who is also a licensed professional counselor, because that's required by our bylaws. So there was one big concern that I kept hearing, and that was anonymity. Why do people have to know who I voted for? And honestly, the votes couldn't be anonymous because we had to verify that every vote submitted was sent from a current member and that they're a licensed professional counselor. That issue of anonymity was an important one to me, because when we think about it, most of the elections we participate in are not anonymous. When we go to vote in our city elections, we go to the table, we show them our ID, we maybe have our voter registration, and they go ahead and check it. And they associate that vote with a little number that's at the top of the ballot. And that's the reason I wanted to address that one specifically, because it's not one that necessarily, it just needed explanation. It doesn't necessarily need investigation. That the only people who saw those votes were the election committee, and no current board member other than Catherine was able to see them. Okay. All right, now MMHCA history. Just the past 10 years or so, we adopted our bylaws in 2012, and that's the set we're still going by today. MMHCA undertook a concerted effort to grow the size of the membership, primarily through informational meetings around the state. And member dues were the primary source of revenue and were used to fund lobbying efforts and eventually to help rewrite the licensure law. And that eventually resulted in the passage of PA 96 in 2019. So this has been due to many dedicated volunteers who were involved in those efforts over the years, many of whom you know. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, the organization rarely held board meetings after 2010, even though they were mandated in the bylaws. Often when there was an election, it was merely to confirm a slate of pre-selected or kind of single-run candidates for board positions, and they weren't competitive elections. And for the past several years, and the remainder of that time, board members were selected and brought onto the board and appointed by the executive director. And that includes many of the folks who were serving prior to the election. The current bylaws describe MMHCA as a volunteer-run organization. In 2011 to 2014, Jim Blundo was the president of MMHCA, and in 2014, he transitioned to being paid as an executive director. We don't have a position for an executive director as described in the bylaws, and this current board has never seen his contract. The executive director was never meant to be a full-time position. The size of MMHCA doesn't warrant, nor can our budget support, a full-time executive director. And you kind of see what we mean here. The salary has grown by quite a bit over just these last few years into a time where it began to take up a very significant chunk of our total operating budget. And that was a point of concern for a few board members over the past couple of years. Now, MMHCA was instrumental in getting the LPC law, PA 96, passed in 2019, along with many of you. I want to be very clear about that. We did not do that alone. MHCA has offered training that generates additional revenue to fund lobbying efforts that protect and expand our profession. We've offered human trafficking training, implicit bias training, and since the passage of PA 96 in 2019, the bylaws were still not being followed, and appointments by the executive director and the members of the board with positions like treasurer or secretary didn't have access to the tools necessary to do those jobs. Once PA 96 was passed in 2019, the board began pushing for an elected board and to function within the bylaws. Part of that is that we began to review the bylaws as well as to modify them, to modernize them, which has been a long-standing process and one of the big things that the past president, Christy Hottenstein, wanted to do. The board also wanted input on the vision of the organization, access to budget information, and operational details. And our new last president, Christy Hottenstein, took office in July of 2023 with a plan to have a full election in June of 2024. The board was met with resistance to this. So the areas of resistance, there was kind of an ongoing issue of getting budget and financial information by the board to help inform the decisions of the board. We never really received detailed reporting on the activities of the executive director. When a board member did attempt to engage in the due diligence that's required of a board for financial accountability, we were met with an attempt to remove a member of the board. And upon insistence to follow the bylaws as best we could, an assertion was made that none of the board was actually legitimate because of those appointments. That takes us to August 2023. August 2023, many of you may have seen the video, but it was the second month of what was supposed to be the last appointed presidency and board. At that meeting, a board member who questioned financial issues was motioned to be removed from the board. The new president, who had committed to functioning under the bylaws, was treated with disrespect. And the executive director changed the agenda without her knowledge or approval, which is a function of the president. When the president at that time resigned due to the overall conflict, the executive director said he would step in and act as president. But the board was able to kind of make sure that that didn't happen. And Dr. Catherine James, who was the past president, stood up to chair our organization for those next few months, so we could have an interim election. In September, the election committee was formed according to the bylaws and began the work to have an election, the first competitive one in many years, and perhaps ever in this organization. On October 9th, a day before the committee was to send out the election information to the membership, the executive director personally sent a notification using Constant Contact, which is a previous communication tool that we had, to send a membership that he was reorganizing MHCA due to a dysfunctional board. On October 11th, the executive director sent that same email using that same system to over 1,000 lapsed members. The board reacted by having an emergency Zoom meeting with membership that many of you may have attended to explain and correct the executive director's unauthorized and inappropriate actions. The election was held, but there were problems, as we mentioned before. To the best of our knowledge, the executive director allowed one candidate access to that same Constant Contact system so that that candidate could send a private mailing to all the members on that first day of the voting period. That resulted in part of the election being rerun a week later when both candidates could submit information to be submitted to membership. November 2023, despite all the interference and all the issues we had, the election was completed, the votes were tallied, and winners were announced. Last week, before the newly elected board's first meeting, the board requested, the bookkeeper requested the financial report, so the board could begin to talk about the budget, which has still not been passed, and we've been operating on a continuing resolution. And it's normal that we receive that information prior to every board meeting. The night before the meeting, last Thursday, the executive director sent an email to the board that he had instructed the bookkeeper to not give the board the current financial report until, quote, until the makeup of the board is legally determined, end quote. This judgment was made unilaterally by the executive director. The budget should have been discussed and approved before the start of the fiscal year in July of 2023, and that discussion has yet to occur. The membership elected board's first meeting the next day, last Friday. The board had no alternative but to relieve the executive director of his duties because of numerous unapproved actions on his part over several months. Within hours after that meeting, the executive director, using that same system of constant contact, sent a communication to all current and past members claiming that he was forming a new organization or that he was rebranding MMHCA. That was still unclear to me, and appointing his own board that comprised mainly of people who had run in the MMHCA election. This was unauthorized, completely outside of the bylaws, and in complete defiance of the member-elected board, using MMHCA communication resources. So that's where we're at now. But I don't want to spend this entire meeting just talking about what's been going on and all the chaos that all of you witnessed. I want to talk about where we're headed and what the point of all this is. So first, the board is committed to moving forward and making MMHCA member-driven, which means we're here to serve the needs of our membership and not the needs of a few or anyone else. It's to be determined by what you need. And that includes training, consultation, lobbying when it's needed, and assessing and responding to member needs on a more regular basis. This board is going to be transparent with our membership, will be professional, and will keep you updated. We hope that you, the membership, will join us in this effort to serve and uplift LPCs in Michigan. I want to articulate a few of the things that I said there, just to give them a little bit more definition, because it could be a lot of empty statements. When I say membership driven, what I mean is we want to include more of our membership in activities, committees, and planning for the future. We're looking to work with and develop the leadership of the future of this organization. We can move on to the next slide. Learning more about the priorities of our membership and creating benefits and improvements that will bring positive change for you and your practice. The other thing that I think is so important that I see many other professional organizations work on is the benefits in training and education. And we can move on to the next slide too. Training and education. I'm on a few other professions mailing lists, and I see constantly they're getting sent things to enrich their practice and to make things better for them. And so we've offered a handful of training programs based on requirements established by the state of Michigan, but we want to expand on that significantly to build up a library of trainings our members can access. And those trainings include things about working with different counseling techniques, working with different populations, ethics, how to build a practice, and more. All those things we don't really get enough of in graduate school. And we also want to continue our lobbying efforts. And that goes to protecting and promoting our profession. We want to engage in more proactive lobbying efforts rather than being reactive. And we want to develop great relationships with other professions and community partners to advocate for mental health treatment across the spectrum. So thank you for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it. I do see that there were some questions in the chat. If you do have questions, please email them to us at mmhcabi@gmail.com, and we will seek to get back to you on those. If you're interested in getting engaged with the organization, in being on committees or working with the board to kind of bring some of these things to happen, please do. That's what we need. Thank you for showing up, and I look forward to many of you who want to work with us to make MMHCA and the professional counseling here in the state of Michigan as strong as it can be. Have a wonderful night.